My name is Caroline Mitchell. I'm 48 years old, and I live just outside Lexington, Kentucky. The day my mother-in-law tried to humiliate me in family court, she leaned over with a satisfied smile and whispered, "You'll be lucky if the judge even believes a word you say." 30 seconds later, the judge looked directly at me, stood from the bench, and said something that made the entire courtroom freeze. "Ma'am, before we begin, I'd like to thank you for your service." I heard my former mother-in-law stop breathing for a second. Then she whispered to my ex-husband, "What service?" He looked just as confused as she did, because after 12 years of marriage, neither of them had ever bothered to ask who I really was. And that simple mistake would end up costing them far more than they ever imagined. I'll never forget that Thursday morning. Courtrooms all smell the same. Old wood, coffee that's been sitting too long, paper, anxiety. I sat on the second row, holding my 9-year-old son's hand. Ethan kept bouncing his knee. "Mom?" "Yeah, buddy?" "What if they make me live somewhere else?" That question hit harder than anything his grandmother had said. I squeezed his hand. "No matter what happens today," I smiled, "you're going to know one thing." "What?" "Your mom never stopped fighting for you." He nodded. That seemed enough, for now. Across the room sat my ex-husband, Brian. Next to him, naturally, was his mother, Judith. Judith had always treated court like another social event. Perfect hair, designer purse, pearl earrings. She spotted me immediately. "There she is." She smiled without warmth. I expected someone less confident. I ignored her. She wasn't talking to me. She was performing for everyone around her. That's what Judith always did. Brian looked uncomfortable. He'd developed that habit during the divorce, never looking anyone directly in the eyes, especially mine. Judith leaned toward me again. "You know," she said quietly, "you could have avoided all this if you just admitted you weren't enough." I looked at her. For years, I would have apologized. Not anymore. "I guess we'll see." She laughed. "Oh, sweetheart, I already know." What she didn't know was that she'd spent 10 years judging a woman she'd never actually met. 3 years earlier, life looked completely different. Brian and I had been married almost 9 years. We weren't rich, not even close. I managed maintenance operations for the county emergency management department. Not glamorous, but steady. Good benefits, meaningful work. Brian owned a small remodeling company. Business had always gone up and down. Some years were fantastic, others not so much. That never bothered me. Marriage wasn't supposed to be 50-50 every single month. Sometimes one person carried more, then the other did. That's just life. At least, that's what I believed. Judith believed something else entirely. According to her, her son carried everyone. The funny thing is, most of our bills came out of my paycheck. Mortgage, insurance, health coverage, retirement. I handled all of it. Brian's income covered projects, vacations, improvements around the house. We'd agreed to it years before. Never seemed like a problem until Judith decided it was. She'd stop by unannounced, open the refrigerator, comment on dinner, look around the house. "You work too much." Then, "You don't make enough." I honestly never figured out how both things could be true at the same time. One Thanksgiving, she watched Brian carve the turkey. Then she looked at me. "Caroline." "Yes?" "Don't you think a husband deserves a wife who's home more?" I smiled politely. "I was home." She shook her head. "You know what I mean." Brian laughed awkwardly. "Mom, what?" "I'm just saying." That became her favorite sentence. "I'm just saying." She'd criticize, then hide behind those 3 words. "I'm just saying." Our son Ethan was 6 when things started changing. Kids notice tension before adults admit it exists. One evening, he asked, "Grandma doesn't like you, does she?" I nearly dropped the spaghetti spoon. "What makes you think that?" "She smiles different." Kids, they see everything. I knelt beside him. Sometimes adults don't agree. "But she likes Dad better." I couldn't lie. "She loves her son." He looked at me. "I love you." That nearly broke me. Brian wasn't cruel. That's the hardest part to explain. He wasn't mean, he wasn't abusive. He simply stopped choosing. Whenever his mother criticized me, he'd stay quiet. Whenever she crossed a line, he'd change the subject. Whenever I asked him to speak up, he'd sigh. "She's just old-fashioned." "No," I told him one night. "She's disrespectful." He rubbed his forehead. "Can't we just let it go?" I stared at him. "Do you know how many times I've let it go?" He didn't answer, because neither of us knew anymore. Then came the house. Funny thing is, the argument wasn't about money. At least not at first. It started with paint. We'd bought a modest fixer-upper years earlier. Nothing fancy. Needed work. Lots of work. Every extra dollar went into improving it. New roof, updated plumbing, kitchen, windows, weekend after weekend. Brian loved working on it. I loved watching it slowly become home. Judith hated every minute of it. She constantly reminded us we should have bought somewhere bigger, more impressive, closer to her neighborhood. "People judge where you live," she'd say. I always answered the same way. "The bank doesn't care what people think." She never laughed. About 18 months before the divorce, a county representative knocked on our front door. I assumed it was about storm drainage. Instead, he handed me an envelope. Inside was an official notice. Our neighborhood had been selected for a major redevelopment project. Property values were expected to increase significantly over the next several years. I remember looking at Brian. This could actually be good. He smiled. Maybe all that work finally pays off. It felt exciting, hopeful. Judith felt differently. When she heard, she frowned. "So you're telling me that little house is suddenly worth something?" Brian nodded. She got quiet. Really quiet. Looking back, that should have worried me. About 2 weeks later, Judith invited us to dinner. Her tone was unusually cheerful. That alone should have been a warning. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Then dessert arrived. She folded her hands. "I've been thinking." Brian smiled. "About what?" "The future." Nobody spoke. She looked at me. "Caroline, I think it would be smartest if Brian protected the investment." I frowned. "What investment?" "The house." I laughed. "Our house?" She nodded. "You should transfer it into Brian's name." I honestly thought she was joking. "I'm sorry?" "You're the one with potential legal liability." "What liability?" "You work for the county." I blinked. "What does that have to do with anything?" She smiled patiently. "Oh, honey, you never know what lawsuits can happen." Brian didn't laugh, didn't interrupt, didn't tell her she was being ridiculous. He simply sat there. I looked at him. "Brian?" He cleared his throat. "I mean, it might not be a terrible idea." That sentence landed like a freight train. I stared at my husband. "Our home? It's just paperwork." "No, it's protection." "For who?" Neither answered. Dinner ended shortly afterward. The drive home was silent. Finally, I asked, "Did your mother put you up to this?" "No." "You've never once mentioned changing the deed." "I've been thinking." "When?" He looked out the windshield. "Recently." I suddenly realized those weren't his words. They were hers. A month later, he asked again, this time more directly. If something happened, I'd feel better if everything stayed protected. Our home already is protected." He sighed. "You don't understand." "No, I don't. Because I wasn't hearing my husband anymore. I was hearing Judith. Every sentence, every concern, every suspicion coming out of Brian's mouth. That's when I knew something had changed. I just didn't know how much. The divorce papers arrived 6 months later. No warning, no counseling, no final conversation. Just a process server standing on my porch while Ethan played video games upstairs. Irreconcilable differences. Request for primary custody. Request regarding marital property. Request for exclusive possession of the residence. I kept rereading one sentence. Exclusive possession. Our home. The one we'd rebuilt together. The one I helped pay for every single month. I sat at my kitchen table until my coffee turned cold. Then colder. I never even took one sip. The next several months became paperwork. Lawyers, bank statements, mortgage records, school schedules, tax returns, everything. Brian suddenly claimed he'd been the primary financial provider. That wasn't true. His attorney claimed the house's increased value resulted primarily from Brian's labor. Partly true. But who paid the mortgage while he remodeled? Who paid insurance, utilities, property taxes? That part kept getting ignored. Judith loved telling relatives Brian built that house, as though I'd been living somewhere else. Then something strange happened. My attorney called. "Caroline, I need you to come in." His tone worried me. When I arrived, he slid several documents across his desk. I requested additional county records. Okay. He tapped one page. "You never mentioned this." "I never mentioned what?" He looked at me carefully. "The redevelopment committee." I frowned. "What about it?" "You served on it." "I wasn't allowed to discuss pending projects." "I understand." He leaned back. "But these records are public now." I stared at him. He smiled. "Do you realize your former husband bought you out using the property's old valuation?" My stomach dropped. "What?" "He filed for exclusive ownership before redevelopment became public." I couldn't breathe. "He knew?" My attorney didn't answer immediately, then quietly said, "I think someone did." And suddenly, every conversation Judith had made perfect sense. Every dinner, every push, every request to transfer the deed, every accusation. It had never been about protecting the house. It had been about taking it before its value exploded. I looked up. "Can we prove it?" My attorney slowly opened one final folder. Inside was something neither Brian nor Judith knew existed. And the moment I read the first page, I realized the courtroom battle hadn't really started yet. I stared at the folder for several seconds before I finally looked back at my attorney. "What exactly am I looking at?" He slid the top document toward me. "Meeting minutes." "From the redevelopment committee?" He nodded. "They became public after the project was officially approved." I flipped through the pages. There it was. Every meeting, every vote, every projected increase in property values. Then I noticed something highlighted near the bottom of one page. Property owners within the redevelopment district would receive written notification approximately 60 days before the public announcement. I frowned. I never got one. You couldn't. Why not? Because committee members weren't allowed to receive advance notices. You already knew. That made sense. Then he tapped another document. "But your husband wasn't on that committee." I looked closer. It was a certified mailing record. The notification had been delivered to our home, signed for by Brian. 3 weeks before he first asked me to transfer the house into his name. I sat there without saying a word. Funny thing is, sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives on one ordinary piece of paper. And suddenly, every conversation you've had over the past year starts making sense. I drove home in silence. That evening, Ethan was building a model airplane at the kitchen table. Mom? Yeah? You okay? I forced a smile. I will be. Kids always know when you're pretending. He nodded anyway. I saved you the blue pieces. I appreciate that. Sometimes that's all a child can offer, and somehow, it's enough. Over the next month, my attorney became busier than I'd ever seen him. We subpoenaed emails, mortgage documents, property records, bank statements. None of it felt dramatic, just paperwork. Lots of paperwork. The kind people usually find boring. But paperwork has a funny habit. It tells the truth long after people stop doing it. One afternoon, my attorney called. We got something. What? The appraisal. I drove straight to his office. He placed two reports side by side. The first appraisal valued our home at what it had been worth before the redevelopment announcement. The second, completed only 8 weeks later, showed an increase of nearly $300,000. I stared at the numbers. Brian had tried to buy out my half using the lower value before I even knew the neighborhood had officially changed. He planned this. My attorney nodded slowly. I believe he did. But believing isn't enough. No, he smiled. Fortunately, we don't have to rely on belief. The court hearing finally arrived in late September. I barely slept the night before. Not because I feared losing, because I was exhausted. Divorce doesn't just empty your bank account. It empties your energy, your confidence, your ability to imagine normal life again. By 8:30, the courthouse lobby was already crowded. Families, lawyers, children carrying backpacks. Life continuing while everyone waited for a stranger to decide pieces of it. Ethan stayed with my sister that morning. I didn't want him sitting through another hearing. Kids deserve better than courtrooms. Brian arrived with Judith. She looked exactly like she always did. Perfect, composed, certain. She smiled when she saw me. You look tired. I've had a busy few months. I'm sure. She glanced toward my attorney. I hope you didn't spend too much money chasing something you can't win. I simply smiled. No point arguing. Some people don't recognize confidence until it's too late. Inside the courtroom, everything moved quickly. The judge reviewed financial records, parenting schedules, property issues. Nothing unusual. Brian's attorney spoke first. He described Brian as the driving force behind the home's improvements. He praised Brian's craftsmanship, his long hours, his dedication. Most of it was true. Brian had worked incredibly hard. I never denied that. Then came the part that wasn't. He claimed Brian had acted in good faith throughout the separation. My attorney quietly stood. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit 21. The judge nodded. You may. My attorney handed over the certified mail receipt. The judge studied it, then looked towards Brian. Mr. Mitchell, did you receive this notification? Brian hesitated. Yes. Did your wife know about it? No. Were you aware the redevelopment announcement would substantially affect property value? Silence. His attorney shifted uncomfortably. Brian finally answered. I suspected. The courtroom became very quiet. Then my attorney introduced something none of us expected. An email, recovered during discovery. Brian had sent it to a financial advisor. The subject line read, Timing. One sentence was highlighted. Once Caroline signs, the appreciation becomes my problem, not ours. Not ours. Mine. The judge read it twice, then looked over his glasses. Mr. Mitchell, would you like to explain this? Brian opened his mouth, closed it again. Judith suddenly stood. Your Honor? The judge stopped her immediately. "Ma'am, you are not testifying." She slowly sat back down. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked scared. The hearing continued another hour. No shouting, no dramatic speeches, just facts. Mortgage payments, income records, tax returns, every canceled check, every statement. My attorney showed that I paid nearly 70% of the mortgage during our marriage, health insurance, utilities, property taxes, even most renovation materials. Brian provided labor. I provided stability. The house existed because both of us built it. The judge acknowledged exactly that. Then came custody. Honestly, that mattered much more than the property. The judge reviewed Ethan's school records, attendance, medical appointments, teacher evaluations. Every single report described me as the parent consistently involved in his daily life. Brian loved our son. I never questioned that. But love and responsibility aren't always the same thing. The judge understood the difference. Finally, after nearly 5 hours, everyone stood silently as the judge adjusted his glasses. I have reviewed the testimony, the financial evidence, and the documentary exhibits. He paused. This court finds that Mr. Mitchell knowingly attempted to obtain an unfair financial advantage through incomplete disclosure of material information. Brian lowered his eyes. The judge continued. The marital residence shall be revalued using its current market value. I closed my eyes for a second. Not because of the money, because justice sometimes moves slowly, but it does move. He wasn't finished. Mrs. Mitchell shall retain primary physical custody of Ethan. My throat tightened. The parenting schedule previously recommended by the mediator is approved. I finally exhaled. Months of holding my breath, gone in one sentence. Outside the courthouse, Brian caught up with me. "Caroline." I turned. He looked older than I remembered. "I messed up." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he said quietly, "I let my mother convince me this was about protecting myself." I nodded. "I know." "I'm sorry." "You should be." He looked down. "I don't expect forgiveness." "I know. But Ethan deserves better than this." That was the first completely honest thing he'd said in a long time. "I agree." Judith walked outside a minute later. She looked like she wanted to say something. Instead, she simply stood there. Finally, she whispered, "I never thought it would end this way." I answered calmly, "It didn't have to." She looked away. For once, there wasn't another argument, no excuse, no performance. Just silence. Sometimes silence says everything. 6 months later, the house sold for far more than either of us expected. After everything was divided fairly, I bought a smaller place on the other side of town. Nothing fancy, just enough. A front porch, 2 bedrooms, a maple tree in the backyard. Ethan claimed the upstairs room before the movers even finished unloading. "I can see squirrels from my window." He sounded happier than I'd heard him in years. I appreciate that. Sometimes that's all a child can offer. And somehow, it's enough. Brian eventually apologized again, not because a judge told him to, because life finally slowed down enough for him to recognize what he'd traded away. Our conversations became easier, short, respectful, focused on Ethan. That's all they needed to be. Judith rarely called anymore. When she did, the conversations stayed polite. Distance has a strange way of teaching lessons that arguments never can. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan and I planted tomatoes in our backyard. He looked up at me. "Mom? Yeah? Do you miss the old house?" I thought about it. The weekends spent painting walls, the kitchen we'd remodeled together, the porch where Ethan learned to ride his bike. I miss the memories, but not the fighting. He nodded thoughtfully. I like it here better. So do I. He smiled. You know why? Why? Because nobody argues about who owns this house. I laughed. No, they don't. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether winning in court felt satisfying. Honestly, not the way they imagine. The real victory wasn't the money, or the property, or proving someone wrong. The real victory happened months later when Ethan stopped asking if everything was going to be okay, because he already knew it was. That's when I realized something I'll carry for the rest of my life. A house can be taken away. Money comes and goes. Even a marriage can fall apart. But your integrity, that's the one thing nobody can steal unless you hand it over yourself. And I'm grateful I never did. The end.